One of the best metrics you can have in place, and probably the most valuable to have in place in an organization when it comes to built-in quality, is user story velocity. That's different than the velocity of estimated story points, which are very arbitrary and should only really be the uh, numbers that the team itself is looking at. It helps them do planning. Here's how well we've been doing for the past several iterations when it comes to our estimates of effort. And now here's what we're going to commit to based on our current estimates of effort. But it's not a very good indication of delivered work. A better indication of that is number of user stories delivered per iteration. An average of that number over the past 5. I wouldn't go beyond 5. It doesn't help very much. And I wouldn't make it any smaller than 5, shorter than 5. 5 ends up being a pretty good number of iterations to average together to figure out for this particular team, what is the cadence at which we can expect them to be delivering work. The next thing to do as soon as you have that metric in place is to help your teams to get better at defining or making sure their user stories all are consistent. In most organizations, they're not. The user story backlog ends up just being a backlog of work effort. Kanban is probably a better approach where each item is just simply a work item, more like a task, than it is a user story. But we tend to have a mixture of both tasks, user stories, and epics, all called user stories in our backlog. But it's not obvious that that's what's happening. And it wasn't obvious to me until I started developing a better definition of what a user story is. However, just sitting down and writing a definition of a user story doesn't help very much. I found that didn't benefit me very much at all until I started doing something different, and that is expecting specific levels of quality of the user stories themselves. And let me give you an example, and one that we're going to talk about, a good user story phrase. I knew from the very beginning when user stories first came out that the expectation was they're phrased as a role. I want a feature or behavior or an event so that I get a business value. And there is a lot of good work out there on the original arguments, by the way, on why that is so beneficial and helpful. And engineers really appreciate when that's followed. What happens, I find, though, is the person writing the story has a hard time formulating that user story phrase. It doesn't capture the whole thought, or it's like the only phrases I can come up with extend things beyond what I really want done. And it took me a while to realize the reason we're having those challenges is that the things we're describing are probably either epics or they are tasks. And I discovered that when I really forced myself to use user story phrases, properly formed, fully complete, that I started exposing that fact. So here's an example. If you have something that's an epic and you're having a hard time coming up with a good user story phrase for it, try just using a user story phrase for a part of it. And if you end up with 2, 3, 4 user stories that together describe what you're trying to deliver, that's an immediate indication for you that this is really an epic. In fact, it's a great indication of how you could now take that work and describe it in multiple user stories, put those all on the backlog, smaller pieces of work. Okay. You might say, well, that's, it's the same amount of work. Now I'm just splitting it in 4 stories. So now it looks better if I'm doing user story, doing it measuring based on user story velocity, because I get 4 stories for the price of 1. Well, you can look at it that way. What I look at it instead is, because you got it more specifically defined, I can be more agile as a team. If someone comes and says in the middle of an iteration, we need you to switch up and change now, and I'm only partway through the one big user story, now I have to kind of stop that work, and by the end of the iteration, I can't get it completed. Now it carries over to the next iteration. If I have from the beginning split that up into 3 or 4 stories, and I'm partway through the first one, somebody comes and says, we need you to switch to something, I can say, give me just a couple hours here. I'll get this story finished. and then we'll go on to that work. And now I can carry that other work over as a user story that never got started, and we never committed to it, and it's getting committed to in the next iteration, and there's no harm. I'm not stuck with a user story that got partially finished and I'm carrying it over. I just have stories that I committed to. Something changed in the business. We move it forward. And now my metrics are still reliable and accurate, and I get at least partial credit right then, that iteration, for the work that I did. It makes us much more agile when we do that. The original definition of a user story, and I'm paraphrasing here, and it's kind of my own kind of lean toward it, but it is the smallest possible piece of work that still has business value. And sometimes we have a hard time considering things like maybe even a paging function on a report as being, a user story. Well, it is. It's that just having the page numbers on there and being able to go back and forth between the pages, it has business value. Let me think through what that business value is for somebody. Why would somebody want that feature? How in the world would it help them? That's your business value. And so I think it helps us to try to think down on the smaller pieces. The other thing that you can run into is where you're trying to write a user story phrase, but the thing you're having implemented, it only really addresses part of that, or it's just a piece of it. Usually it's a task that I'm trying to phrase in a user story. And at those times, I find it much more beneficial for myself, my teams, if we instead look for an existing user story for which this functionality completes it, maybe even a completed user story from another team where they did their work and it's complete, but now this part is needed to finish the feature. I'm going to refer to that in this user story, and then we come up with some mechanism for indicating that this is really just a task, maybe a checkbox on there that says task. If you have an issue type that's task, convert it to a task. Or at the least, in the title, just put the word task somewhere in parentheses or up at the beginning, so it's obvious to everybody, yes, this is a user story that got delivered, but it's actually a task that completes some other work somewhere. So now we can filter that in the metric, and we can know that what we're really seeing is just a task that completed a user story, and the completion of that story is somewhere else. If one team did the task and another team finished the user story, does it mess things up? Well, no. The main thing you're looking for is organizationally what their velocity is, and remember, it's an average over the past few iterations. If during one iteration you did more tasks than user stories for a period, okay, so it's a low number that particular iteration. But if I'm looking over the past 5, that's going to average out. It's all going to come out in the wash. Also, that may be a team where they constantly are doing more tasks than user stories. It's okay. You don't compare their numbers with each other. You're just looking at that number to see how much completed work can we expect from this team. There may be a legitimate reason they only get a couple of stories done or 3 or 4 stories done per iteration. They're helping the other teams keep their velocity up. So as an organization, your metric is still good. It still helps you know as an organization how well are we delivering, and as teams, how well we're delivering, without nitpicking about why a certain team's numbers at a certain place. That shouldn't matter. Just measuring that is good, and then getting that definition of a user story down. Now, that the user story phrase is just one of the things I use, and it's not necessarily, you need them all put together to end up with a good definition of a user story. So don't hear me saying that as long as you have a user story phrase, you have a good user story. That's not the case. But I at least want that phrase out, and it helps both the product owner, the person writing the user story, and the team delivering the user story know better what size of this thing is. So let's get to one more part of this, and you'll hear this as a common theme for me when it comes to engineers, and that's really what this is for, by the way. I want to speak to the business when it comes to measuring using user story velocity, and the need for those definitions to improve to get your numbers to be more reliable and consistent. But the engineers, the software development engineers in test, the QA engineers, the manual test engineers, UAT, those folks that do that part, this is for you. Okay, this is to help you be professional about your work. So when you get a user story, expect it to be in that phraseology as a role. I want this function or feature so that I get this business value. Just expect that. Set that as an expectation. And I usually say, put that in your definitions of ready. In our definitions of a user story ready for us to even commit to, we expect a properly formed user story phrase. Just set that as an expectation. Now your product owner can see that, and it's on you to expect it. It's on them to deliver that. Sometimes they may not be able to come up with one. Okay, you can help them. Use that during refinement. When you're going to refine the backlog, take some time as a group, you and this product owner, to help figure out a good phrase for it. That'll force you to ask the right questions to come up with a phrase. You're already refining the description of it and the work by going through that process to come up with that phrase to help them do that. But let's say you're on a team where, for the most part, they aren't really excited about this type of thing. Okay. How do I still be a professional in what I do on this team that may not be as interested in doing the same thing? We have to come to team agreements, and you have to work well in that team using those team agreements. You can't be disagreeable. And so what I try to do is use an approach that's very soft, but still exposes things, and to which I can commit to doing a good job, even if the rest of the team's kind of struggling with that at the moment. So how do I go about that? The first thing I do is I'll if it's just me on my own, I at least spend 5 minutes a day refining the backlog, by the way. And it seems like, well, that's not much time, but you can actually get through a lot if you use a good methodology of doing that. So during that time, if I spot a user story where there's not a good phrase, I'll use the comment first. That's my first attempt at communicating back and forth and getting improvement, is I'll use the comment. And I usually let them know, hey, I'm unfamiliar with this area of the application, or I'm a little uncertain what you're looking for, and I want to make sure I get it right. I truly do. I want to make sure I get right what they truly want. And if I don't feel it's been communicated to me sufficiently, for me, I let them know, this is for me. This isn't because I think you didn't do a good job. This is for me. I need a little help here. And so then I write out the user story phrases that I think describe fully what's being requested in the description that they gave me for that user story. And at the end of that, I asked them, could you confirm for me my understanding here? Did I miss anything? Or is there anything here that I made some assumptions we need to remove it? I just get some clarification from them about my understanding of the user story. And I document that in the comment. If they'll accept that and that becomes our method of communication, that's one of the better places to be. Because at the end of an iteration, if that particular user story didn't get done and somebody asked the question, why didn't it get done? Instead of answering, well, it was too big, I can say, well, can I look at my comment? I don't remember my thinking then. Can we look at my comment and see if there's anything there that could help us understand why this happened? And right there is going to be my list of individual user story phrases, and everybody in that meeting can see, we at least had an opportunity where we could have split this up if we wanted to. Whether they make a change next time or not, who knows? Hopefully they're into continuous improvement and they will change, or they will try to strive for something different. But if not, at least it was exposed there. It was made obvious and clear. It's something we could have done. You offered a solution very gently that could have been used to avoid this the next time. Let's say somebody on the team doesn't appreciate the comment in the user story. Okay, well, then I'll use some other method of communication. I might use Teams or Slack, and I will do one of two things. I don't want to be offensive. I don't want to trigger anything. I want to be sensitive of people where they're at. Okay, we're all professional, and so maybe it shouldn't be that way, but it is. We're all people. We've got our sensitivities. And so I'll communicate to an individual and CC the group sometimes if I know that the group really would be interested in that. Maybe I've already had discussions, or we have, and so they really want to know. Or I'll at least message that person directly. I'll say, hey, I noticed you write this user story. I'm trying to make sure I understand it. And I get that communication in a form where it's archived. So it's either a text message, a chat message, or it's an email. Email's much better, I think. And I get that documented. Hey, I had this conversation with them. This is what I brought up. Here was the response. There's where we're at. Again, when we get to a retrospective, that's fair game then to say, I did try to come up with some ideas for how we could improve that user story. And maybe we could consider that for next time, the same type of thinking that I used here in trying to understand what you were asking of us. Okay. If that doesn't work, and really that I don't see why that wouldn't work, then I will at least keep notes of my own. I won't communicate them anymore. They trigger things for people, and I don't want to cause problems and disrupt the team, but I still, for myself, want to do a quality job. And so splitting up those user story phrases, even if it doesn't result in improvement for the team, it at least helps me to understand what we're looking at. And if I give an estimate that's high and people ask why, I can point at, or I can refer to, maybe not show them, but I can refer to my understanding of what this thing is. And so regardless, getting that down helps me. If it doesn't help the team, at least it helps me to be professional about the work I'm committing to and how well I'm estimating it and setting expectation. I hope you could see that just even using user story phrases, just that one bit of user story refinement, if we start doing that for every single user story, your team, your company, your organization is going to begin to start experiencing an improvement in the quality of the user stories just from that. So my hope is that you'll reconcile yourself to requiring good quality user story phrases for every user story that comes in, refining that user story itself, and therefore experiencing an improvement in the quality of your work.